Well, here we are on the last day of our conference, and it's a great pleasure to welcome Nicholas LaHayes, who earned his PhD in computational data sciences from Chapman University, while working as a data scientist with the Processing Algorithms and Calibration Engineering Group at JPL, Jet Propulsion Lab, where he's been since 2013. A little bit about his research. His research focuses include applying unsupervised deep learning to large multi-sensor data sets, to segment and track objects in low and no label environments, smoke fumes, algal blooms, burn scars. He's currently working on fast retrieval of physical parameters and associated uncertainties in domains of water quality and cloud remote sensing and uncertainties using deep learning. Unlike your comment here, he's generally passionate about applying machine learning-based solutions to help better understand and mitigate the climate crisis, natural hazards, and biodiversity loss. So let's welcome Nick, and he's going to talk to us today about towards automated tracking of wildfires and smoke plumes across multi-sensor scenes. Over to you, Nick.
Thanks for the intro, and hi again. So I'm going to be talking today about some work I've been doing with some collaborators here at JPL, also at IIT, Temple, and UT Dallas. I guess we'll start with some. We'll start with some motivation. We'll go into some background, the overview of the approach, some concrete applications, and maybe proof of concept discussions. We'll talk about kind of what we're currently doing with work on the actual dynamic tracking across scenes from individual sensors and sensor sets, and also disparate data sets, and then some future work discussions as well. So the basic motivation behind this kind of broad set of work here is that there's a bunch of sensors that are currently orbiting Earth. There's a lot of historic data sets from previous sensors, and there's a whole suite of sensors that are planned for like the next generation of both NASA and international partners. We're putting up orbital sensors, and then we also have suborbital sensors, or sensors on aircraft or drones. And there's always been this kind of goal to be able to use all this data in an interconnected fashion, leveraging the different specialties that various kinds of sensors have, but getting more of a kind of tiered interconnected view of these systems that are being studied. Some difficulties with that: there's per instrument quirks. So each instrument has its own issues, difficulties, specificities that are required to deal with it and its associated data sets. The complexities increase, the more data that you add to a problem, you need more compute, all that kind of stuff. But there is some general need for some kind of as generic as possible way to handle all this data. So there's lots of good work being done in the digital twin domain, and the part of this work that we're trying to extract out is to be able to use this data collectively to identify and track instances of objects. So in this case, like wildfire and smoke plumes, but I'll talk about some other use cases as well. I already touched on, we want to use these instruments as a kind of a pre-existing sensor web without having to, connect and redeploy a bunch of more instrumentation. We already have all of these data sets that we can use collectively. So a little bit of background, just so we can all be on the same page for what the problem is that we're trying to work on. So there's lots of different subsets of problems within the computer vision domain. Here we're dealing with data that is line by sample in a swath. So image data or image-like data from multi-sensor, hyperspectral, synthetic aperture radar, many different kinds of sensor types, but they're all taking data in this two-dimensional or three-dimensional domain, that third dimension being the number of channels in this case. So there's classification, like this image is of balloons, this image is a cat or a dog. There's semantic segmentation, where you're extracting different types of things from an image and saying like these pixels here are balloons. So that's that second image on the top right there. There's object detection, where we draw boundary boxes around each of the different objects that have been detected. And then there's instance segmentation, where we're identifying distinct instances of the type of thing that we have identified. So bottom right there. And our goal is to be able to do instance segmentation on these type of geophysical objects, so wildfires and smoke plumes, and then be able to track them given a specific signature. And we'll touch on kind of how we do that, just to make a distinction between the what type of problem we're working with here. With our approach, we're doing more of a pixel-based segmentation first, instead of some approaches use convolutional type approaches here. So we'll touch on the reasons why we're doing pixel-based segmentation labeling. We have a lot of problems where there's not any labels existing, or the label sets are difficult to use. They're not precise enough, or in the case where we're trying to use all these airborne and satellite-based instruments, in order to develop a new data set for a new instrument, the traditional route is very time-consuming. So the instrument-based retrieval methods require lots of labor to do instrument-specific calibration to pre-existing algorithm types, or maybe even new algorithm development. And so the goal here is to be able to have something that's a bit more plug and play, and we don't need to have pre-existing labels like a traditional supervised technique would require. So we can utilize this approach in many different areas. Also, just some distinctions that I want to make before we go into the approach. So there's supervised machine learning, which I mentioned. You have a set of ground truth labels, and you're making a mapping. You're developing a mapping via the model between some samples and associated features and that Y or that label set. So you can make a classification or a regression prediction with a new sample after you've trained the model. There's unsupervised learning, which takes no labels and just makes separations of distinct latent patterns in the data, no context applied, requires subject matter expert assessments and context application. And then there's this kind of newer technique kind of right in the middle, the self-supervised learning, which aims to map input data with no ground truth labels to an associated label set, but that label set has no context applied. So you can think of it, similar to unsupervised learning, but there is an associated loss function. There's, neural networks you can train with these loss functions to do this classification, but there's no context applied to those labels. It's just making a separation, a distinction, and then you can come in and make that context assignment after the fact. So in our approach, we're using, in the past, we had been using just unsupervised learning. Now we're using unsupervised and self-supervised learning, and we'll talk about the different options and various techniques that are kind of applied in this pipeline. But the pipeline is pretty straightforward. So just like most data science pipelines, there's some data cleaning that has to be applied. So in this domain, there's fill values or bad pixels. There's oversaturation values that aren't within the valid min and maximum of the pixel range for the instrument or the processing pipeline, things like that. The software system that we're using does do data fusion kind of just as part of the feature extraction technique. So if we're using multiple data sets together, when the spatio-temporal domain allows for it, we have to resample. In our case, we're not doing any resampling to a higher resolution. We don't have any techniques that we're applying to do that. And so in order to remove any confusion or issues with making up data where there isn't pre-existing data by doing like super resolution applications, all we're doing is resampling to the lowest resolution between any data sets that we're combining. So if one data set has a spatial resolution of 1.1 kilometer per pixel and the other one has 500 meters per pixel, we resample to that 1.1 kilometer, the lowest resolution. to avoid any issues there. Then we're doing scaling. Typically, we have to go through this feature extraction, this unsupervised learning path here. So we come through and come up to this RBM-based model box here, which is doing the feature extraction. We use a generative unsupervised technique to do the per pixel feature extraction. I'll talk about more of that. And then there's also this, there's two approaches that are allowed in the software system that we use. One is the traditional unsupervised technique. And then the second one is the self-supervised classification technique that we're using to get this intermediate per pixel classification. And then from there, we'll talk about different approaches for context assignment, given the problem at hand. And then at the end, what you're left with is a context applied segmentation mask or map. So in this case, fire, smoke, and in some cases, we can extract burn scar, depending on the instrumentation that we're using. And then the stuff further on down the flow chart here, we'll talk about later on. That's the tracking work that I'll talk about. But first, just the static segmentation and identification of different types of objects. So just to kind of touch a bit more on what the different pieces of this pipeline look like, what the outputs and inputs look like. This is top left is a reference RGB. In this case, we're using two inputs from two different instruments on the same platform, MISR or the multi-angle imaging spectroradiometer, and MODIS or medium resolution operational, I don't remember what the D is, but imaging spectrometer is IS. So there are two imagers. They've been orbiting Earth for over 20 years now. The Terra satellite that they're on is actually in its declination maneuver to come back to Earth, or actually burn up in the atmosphere. But we combine the data from both of these instruments. One has, I think, like 38 bands, and the other one, MISR, consists of 9 cameras, one at nadir pointing straight down, and then 4 on either side of the nadir camera pointing at the equivalent angles just forward and aft of that nadir camera. So we use co-located imagery, and we resample to the lowest resolution, which in this case is 1.1 kilometers. And then we pass it through and we get this segmentation map here, no context applied, but you can just qualitatively see that it's identifying different entities that exist in the imagery. From there, we do context application. So in this case, this was the case we were using for validation. So we have some pre-existing labels we can compare against, and we can also use them for automated context application. So there's a SVM classifier that has been running operationally for MISR for a long time. And we use that to do best agreement between the different label sets that we have here and the 5 or 6 labels that the SVM produces operationally over, I think, like millions of pixels in our training set. There's a kind of a large scale validation that we did with, accuracy F1 score, those kinds of metrics in one of our papers, I think our 2021 paper. But in this case, just for visual comparison, you can see the smoke from our retrieval in the bottom right and the smoke from the SVM in the bottom left, and then our active fire, and then the MODIS hotspot identification here. In lots of cases, because lots of the satellite-based identifications are thermal anomaly identifications and not just fire front identifications, we do have a smaller number of pixels, and it might be easier to see in one of the examples I show later, but we're identifying kind of more of the fire front, whereas hotspot thermal anomaly products are identifying the hot smoke as well as the fire front. So that's what accounts for a large amount of the distinction here. And we were able to validate that with higher resolution imagery, which I'll show kind of later on. As I mentioned, as a part of our original process, we did a large-scale validation across the Miser-Modis dataset, Landsat and Sentinel-2 data fusion. We looked at Hyperion, which is a hyperspectral imager, I think like 240 bands or something, and some airborne instruments that flew some campaigns that looked at fire and smoke. I have a link to the paper in my last slide, and then also some backup slides that show some of that validation. But you know, just to show kind of this areas that we looked at, you know, ensuring that our test set had areas outside of our training set, so we're not locked into features, geographic features when we're doing validation, things like that, and ensure that we're actually doing proper feature extraction and segmentation. Yeah, so now if we transition into kind of how this works, as I mentioned, that first step is unsupervised feature extraction. And the way that we do that is with a restricted Boltzmann machine or an RBM or an RBM-based architecture. And I'll discuss what those distinctions mean here shortly. So an RBM itself is one of the kind of classic neural network architectures. It is just 2 layers, a visible layer and a hidden layer. It aims to, it's a generative model, so it aims to regenerate or represent the distribution of the input in the latent space. And that latent space is a user-defined dimension, typically a smaller dimension than the input. So in this case here, the visible layer has 5 input features and the hidden layer has 3 features. So this latent space is a compressed representation of the original space. And it does this, or it learns how to represent the input distribution in that latent space by trying to, or doing its best to reconstruct input samples given the hidden samples that it generates. So during training, there's a forward pass that occurs. So it generates the samples in the hidden latent space. And then from those samples, it uses Gibbs sampling to generate new visible samples or a reconstruction of the visible data. And then there's an intercomparison that happens. So comparison between the reconstructed input data and the actual input data. And the goal is to get the distributions of the reconstruction and the original input data as close as possible. So that reconstruction error is what we're trying to minimize here in order to be confident that we're representing the data well enough in that latent space. RBMs are unlike lots of other neural networks in that if you have a deep belief network, which is a set of stacked RBMs in a sequential fashion, so one RBM passes its output as input to the next RBM and so on, they can be trained layer-wise. So instead of doing back propagation across the entire network, for RBMs, you use a process called contrastive divergence, which is that reconstruction error computation and minimization per layer as you move down the network. So it's less resource hungry. And you know, it does a pretty good job. Traditionally, RBMs have been associated with lots of headaches in terms of tuning and some like what's the right word? Unequal performance across domains. But there's been some recent improvement to just underlying neural network software like PyTorch and TensorFlow, and then also some improvements to the sampling techniques. And there was actually a paper that came out of Google Brain, including Jeffrey Hinton, who was the original architect of RBMs, showing that in terms of generating simulated data from generative models, RBMs perform just as well as some of the larger, more common architectures like a variational autoencoder and a GAN in the RGB domain. So they were generating data from like the traditional benchmarks, so like people's faces and the MNIST handwritten digits, stuff like that. And they were showing comparable performance. So RBMs are pretty powerful for the simplistic nature. and they are a bit less resource hungry, so we can use them when the data sets themselves become more complex, without having a significant increase in compute. I talked a bit about the learning, but just a bit more concretely, there's just a predefined energy function based on the fact that an RBM is a specialized version of a Markov field. From there, you can compute the log likelihood function, which is this third function down. If we were to try to use backpropagation, like with other neural networks, the gradient that we would have to compute becomes quite intractable. So it's basically the expectation of the sample of input that we have minus the expectation of the reconstructed input based on the hidden values that we generate. And in order to do that properly, we would have to run an MC-MC chain or multiple MC-MC chains at each iteration, which becomes extremely computationally complex. So instead of doing that for each pass, you do a forward pass, generate those hidden samples. From there, you run a couple of steps of Gibbs sampling in order to get the visible values, appropriate visible values, reconstructed visible values. Then you do a reconstruction error computation between the input data and the data that you sampled from your Gibbs sampling. And that's how you compute the loss at each step instead of having to do full MC-MC chains each iteration. Okay, so as I mentioned, we're doing per pixel feature extraction and labeling using self-supervised or unsupervised techniques. So because we haven't used any convolutions or anything like that where we maintain that spatial structure, what we do is we can either extract just a single pixel and all the associated channels with that pixel, or we can do super pixel extraction, so a pixel and its neighborhood, and then flatten that information and pass it into the RBM. That spatial structure, we get enough of it. The RBM is able to represent enough of it within that local neighborhood for us to get good results out. And we've done a little bit of testing. There are convolutional RBMs, but the computational cost is not equivalent to any improvement in performance. So we're happy with the performance we get out of these per pixel flat RBM structures. But we do have the ability to move to convolutional architectures if needed, but it hasn't been needed in any problems that we have looked at so far. So as I mentioned, these are traditionally used for feature reduction. So the hidden layer is traditionally smaller than the visible layer, but there is previous work both within our literature and then also previously to use this for feature expansion. So we're taking the original input space, this feature space, and we're expanding it into a higher dimension. And the reason for doing that, so the trade-off is more parameters, more data, more computations that are required, but in that higher dimension space, a lot of times models are able to key on more complex patterns in a more simplified manner. So it's akin to applying like the kernel method in more traditional classic machine learning approaches like support vector machines or logistic regression. This is just a kind of neural network version of that. Yeah, so we do have, again, the ability to define architecture as we want, but in most cases, we do that feature expansion. What comes out of the RBM is a non-interpretable matrix of numbers that the model is able to understand. We can understand via the training process that it's doing, generating a representation in that latent space that is representative of the input data, but we can't do anything directly with that output of the RBM or RBM-based architecture. So we have to pass it on somehow to something else to make it human interpretable again. And to do that, traditionally we were using clustering. So we started in our first paper, we did a full evaluation of a whole bunch of clustering techniques, landed on agglomerative clustering, where in the version of agglomerative clustering that we used, hierarchical clustering, each pixel starts as its own cluster, and then there's a heuristic used to merge those clusters until you get to the user-defined number of clusters. And then you get with that an associated dendrogram, so you can understand the relationship between each of the clusters in that hierarchy. Excuse me. Agglomerative clustering was the best performing one. It was one of, so it and k-means, mini batch k-means were some of the only ones that worked with really large data sets. So like spectral clustering was out of the question. There was a few other ones that just didn't work when we scaled to operational data set size. And then once scikit-learn implemented this Birch clustering, which is an optimization of agglomerative clustering, we moved to that. So it's just a more memory efficient version. It's in its implementation and in memory, it's tree based, so you can save that tree to memory. We did have trouble with that over time. Some problems, we weren't able to save that tree and then extract it back out from memory without running into RAM issues. But it did work for a lot of cases, and it was kind of the best approach we had for a while. Let's see, I'll come back to that in a minute. But from there, we have recently moved to this neural network self-supervised approach, where we do clustering with a couple of feed-forward layers attached to, or densely connected layers rather, attached to the end of the RBM. And we use a loss function called invariant information clustering, or IIC loss. Basically what it's doing is it's trying to maximize the mutual information between a sample X and a X prime, which is just a perturbed version of that original sample. And the perturbations that we use are just, we add Gaussian noise, and we vary the standard deviation, keeping the mean at 0 over the epochs of that Gaussian noise. So it's seeing different perturbations of a sample and trying to ensure that the sample and its perturbed version stay in the same label assignment or cluster, and in a way that we maximize the mutual information across all of the samples. So then we have a kind of effective way to assign labels without a pre-existing ground truth set. And so there's a paper that defines and describes kind of the initial experiments of IIC, and they use a flat clustering structure. But we wanted to be able to have a hierarchical approach. Sometimes the flat structure doesn't give us the detail we want. Sometimes we want to be able to, say, take wildfires and smoke plumes and get a more precise signature on it. We want to get more clusters that define that smoke plume, both for the tracking application that I'll talk about, and also just to, you can study aerosol distribution, things like that. You can look at the association of between like aerosol optical depth and the clusters that are assigned, things like that. So it's helpful in different subsets of this problem to have multiple labels assigned to the end object that you're looking at. So to that end, we developed a hierarchical version of this IIC approach, or self-supervised classification approach, where we just have multiple sets of these. It's only 2 layers of densely connected nodes that we're applying for each set of these clusters. And then you have a tree that you can save out to memory. It's still much more memory efficient than the traditional Birch clustering. And we're able to generate outputs and all that in a much quicker fashion. Just to go back to this quickly, so we did some visualizations in one of our original quantitative validation works, where we looked at structure that's maintained using different segmentation approaches here. So we looked at just using clustering, which is an option in our software, using the RBM for feature extraction plus clustering. And then this one isn't exactly apples to apples, but just for the sake of comparison, we did PCA and then visualized the on the left here, it's the first two principal components and the associated label per sample in that space. These two here, this middle one is using just clustering and then applying TSNE to get the samples from that latent space, which in this case contained 2,000 samples into a two-dimensional structure that we could visualize. And then this one, or actually, sorry, this one here is the raw data. So it's instead of 2,000 samples, I think there's something like 20 channels. So the feature space here is 20, where we're reducing it using TSNE. And then the color is the associated cluster that was assigned. And then here is the feature space being 2,000 in that latent space using the RBM. And then again, the color is the label or cluster assigned at the end of the process. So you can see that there's much more cohesion between the clusters. You can actually see structure that's represented here, whereas the other two kind of just look like noise. There are simple problems where just clustering is the solution, but in a lot of these cases, the feature extraction step is a necessary step in order to be able to do this. Okay, so on to the actual application of this, which is fire and smoke. So we've estimated that in order to do this in a supervised fashion, you need about 30 minutes per scene. If you're doing this the right way, you're drawing out the segments, you're using multiple subject matter experts to do the labeling, all that kind of stuff. You're going to need at least 30 minutes to do this per scene, and there's millions of scenes. So that's quite troubling when you're trying to do this in a timely manner. And especially if you're trying to continue to do this when new instruments become developed or get developed rather. And we want to be able to do this in a, again, general plug and play method. And we want to be able to use what we're identifying and kind of track instances of them over time for long range transport studies or fire spread studies, or even things like model validation. So to start, we used data from the FireX AQ campaign in 2019. It's a good place to work because there's coordinated overpasses between aircraft and satellites, polar orbiting satellites. There's fires that were observed using geostationary satellites. So we have all of this combination of data and the actual fires that we need, which is a problem in data sets as well, because those are minority sets, in the terabytes and terabytes of data that satellites collect regularly. So these are just some examples of some various instrumentation. This one shows a geostationary satellite GOES and the actual flight lines of two different aircraft that were flying in FireX AQ. So yeah, so this is the image that we already saw, just as a recap using Miser and MODIS. This one here, so the two airborne instruments, EMOS and MASTER, one has 38 spectral bands and one has 50 spectral bands, and they're flying on two different platforms. So slightly different resolutions. Again, we resampled to the lowest spatial resolution. But this shows, they flew across the same area within minutes of each other. And there was only a very small number of scenes that we had the proper spatio-temporal domain that we could do this, which is another benefit of using pixel-based approaches. We can greatly increase the number of samples that we have when we're using pixel-based approaches. So only having a small number of scenes isn't as much of a problem as if we were using, say, convolutional-based approaches where we need like an entire image or a set of tiles. That sample size shrinks as we increase the domain needed per training sample. This one here is the intermediate output. And then here we are able to capture burn scar smoke. So there's some areas of like sun glint over water, which is just a classic issue with optical remote sensing. But we're able to capture the majority of the smoke plume, and using basic computer vision techniques, like drawing contours with OpenCV, we can kind of close those gaps if we need to for shape representation, which I'll talk about in a minute here. And then, we have the burn scar and then the active fire. There are experimental fire front retrieval products that exist for both of these instruments. But there is a significant disagreement between both of them, and each of them only captures a subset of the actual fire front. So in our case, we're able to actually have significant agreement with both of them capture a larger amount of the fire front just using our single approach. And then here, this is a significant degradation in resolution. So we're looking at, I think, 2 kilometers per pixel. This is the geostationary satellite GOES 17. This is the image over the fire. This is our intermediate product. And then this is the pre-existing aerosol optical depth product, and then the existing fire front product for GOES. So a couple of things, there's with some of the retrieval methods, like thresholded retrieval methods, like the dark target retrieval that GOES uses, there's a lot of confusion between smoke and cloud. And so that's what's happening here. There's actually no retrieval over the entire smoke plume. This doesn't happen all the time, but it is a known problem, and it is a common occurrence with these kinds of approaches. And then we're able to kind of extract the entire smoke plume here. And then the fire front is significantly over segmented here in the pre-existing product, whereas we're kind of more so capturing the actual fire front here. Again, coarse resolution ends up with a coarse product compared to the other ones, but pretty good results kind of in the various resolutions. So we have these static segmentations per scene for multiple different instruments or instrument sets. But the next goal is to be able to, identify and track these things both within scenes from the same instrument or instrument set, but also across different resolutions, different input sets, all that kind of stuff. Towards that, the initial thought is that we have these intermediate products that give us cluster distribution information. So there's multiple clusters, typically multiple labels that are associated with a single object like a smoke plume or a wildfire across all the scenes that we're looking at. And then also there's shape information. So for wildfire tracking, this resolution probably isn't so great, especially with a smaller fire like this, but we can definitely extract shape information for like a smoke plume. And then when we get to resolutions like this, we can look at shape, representation for fire front as well. But we can use this information and do comparisons across scenes. So we can look at, we're currently looking at different kinds of distribution comparison metrics to compare cluster distributions across scenes. So simple ones like Kale divergence or Shannon-Jensen divergence, but also ones that take into account spatial distribution. So like slice Wasserstein distance to do these spatial distribution comparisons. And then also, as I mentioned, we can use OpenCV and their pre-existing contour drawing capabilities to draw representations of a full smoke plume. And then they have pre-existing comparison techniques as well we can use to get differencing between smoke plumes across scenes. That information combined with temporal information and location information can give us a certainty. We're kind of evaluating various techniques to combine all that information, and also add, as you increase distance and as you increase time, things like smoke plumes are warping. So there's some uncertainty associated there. And then because the neural network-based approach that we're using for this self-supervised labeling is generating a softmax value as its output. If we demonstrate that the model is well calibrated, we can use those as a proxy for some semblance of uncertainty. So we can use those uncertainty values to remove kind of some pixels along the boundaries that are less likely to be a part of the plume. While we're doing these shape approximations, really extract the information out of the kind of center of the plume to get a more precise and certain signature, and then do these comparisons in a more precise way. Let's see here. Oh, so kind of initial validation. So we're just looking at comparisons between a handful of plumes across a couple of data sets, and then using these metrics and the associated certainties and the contouring, we want to kind of compare what we've identified as the same plume, and so we're doing that using IOU, or intersection of union, and so these are the agreement values over some number of scenes. So we can get a lot more scenes of the same smoke plume out of GOES. It's geostationary. It's going to collect data over the same area every 5 minutes. So we can increase the temporal repeat, and then Miser is polar orbiting. So we don't have as many scenes that we can do this comparison with, but initial results are good. Again, we're kind of still tuning and tweaking the ability to do kind of longer range transport. But for the initial version of this, we're kind of just sticking right at the fire front and that kind of initial area where the smoke plume exists. So we're confident with the approach before we move to more difficult parts of the problem. As I mentioned, when we start looking across disparate data sets, we're going to look at topological summaries of the data. So there's some folks in our collaborator group that are experts in topological data analysis, geometric deep learning, and all of that stuff. And so we can extract those pieces of information. They are more robust to stretching and different kinds of slight transformations, rotations, things like that. And that might be a more robust characterization of the objects, and we can use that as a part of this tracking effort as well. In the single instrument context, in the cross instrument context, so like say if we're trying to track a smoke plume from an airborne instrument to a orbital instrument, we definitely want to take into account the topological summaries of these objects, because we're going to be moving in resolution. So like if we're moving from like 50-meter resolution to like I don't know, like 150-meter resolution, or 150-meter resolution to 500-meter resolution, that the information that we have is going to change, and the shape and size of that information is going to change. So we need a way to do that mapping between the signatures, because the signatures aren't going to be equivalent across those data sets. And then we also need features that are going to represent the data in a robust way that can provide information to the model that is robust to those changes. So for the mapping, we're looking at applying contrastive learning. So we're looking at all of those features that I mentioned to use for that mapping. So cluster distribution, shape approximation on one end, to the same things for the data set on the other end. And then also definitely topological summaries for this part of the work cross data set. Another thing that we're thinking about looking into is the use of neural operators here. So there's been some recent work out of NVIDIA and Google for climate modeling using these neural operators. So they are parts of neural networks that are a bit better at understanding cross-resolution representations. So we can add that into one of these contrastive learning approaches to do these mappings, but also be a bit more agnostic to cross-resolution differences. but this is kind of in the early stages. That's kind of where we're moving towards. Let's see. This is a kind of a generic approach. So there's some other things that we're working on, some other use cases that we're working on. So as we looked at here, wildfire, smoke, and burn scar, we're also looking at volcanic ash plumes, harmful algal bloom characterization, water body identification in multi-lick SAR imagery, water bodies and ice cover for support for the recently launched SWAT mission, ionospheric anomalies in the kind of heliophysics domain, and then in a completely different domain, microscopy data. We're working with some folks at the Ames, NASA Ames, to do cellular damage characterization. Let's see, and then looking forward, some things that we want to do, expanding regions of study, looking at long-range transport once we're confident with the tracking capabilities in the kind of the short spatio-temporal range, using a web interface to allow for online learning, so identification of misclassifications and feeding that back in to the model for improvement, support of upcoming and future missions, and then also 2D and 3D reconstruction. So we have these different views of all of these objects, smoke plumes, volcanic ash plumes, things like that, at different viewing angles, at different scales. So being able to use that information to do 3D reconstruction is also a kind of future potential research topic. Yeah, that's all I have. This was funded by Professor Yulia Gel's AIST project, Innovative Geometric Deep Learning Models for Onboard Detection of Anomalous Events. And yeah, thank you all for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Okay, any questions maybe from the virtual world there? First. Anyone raising their hand? No. Okay, let's go here to the room. Any questions? Yeah. Maybe come up, yeah, just to. Good point.
Hi, this is Pratik. Thanks for the nice talk. So I was just wondering, so you used RBMs there. So did you use any other techniques like normalizing flows or real NVPs for like this kind of distributional? So you're reconstructing the distribution, right? So for that, did you use any other techniques, or maybe you have experience in some of those for this kind of special scenarios?
Yeah, so we did try at the very beginning of this work. I guess it would be like 7 years ago or so. We did try variational autoencoders, and at some point we did try to kind of utilize GANs as well. But again, in both of those cases, the complexity increase did not match up with any actual improvements of the output for what we were doing. And when we have kind of large number of channels, the amount of parameters required for some of those deeper models is significant. But those were kind of the only two other techniques that we tried, aside from just using the clustering with no kind of feature extraction techniques.
Yeah, okay, thank you. And one more thing, so for the pixels, you're currently everything that you're doing is just based on the neural networks. So did you even did you try to do something like based on, say, for example, like a neighborhood of those pixels which you can just feed into the network with some kind of basis functions or something, like which would probably give some better result? Like, I'm just asking.
So like pre-processing of the neighborhood to get like more of a summary representation, is that?
Yeah. I mean, like, so you're just considering a neighborhood, and you told that the data set size, like you were not able to use the convolutional neural network just because it's say, for example, it's just one image, and then you cannot kind of use convolution for that. But maybe using some kind of basis function approach, maybe you can just consider the neighborhood and then extract information for that neighborhood using those basis functions and input those as feeding to the neural networks, something like that.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. I think you know, any suggestions on pre-processing. So it's not the case that we can't use convolutional neural networks, is that the increase in parameter and compute space doesn't match up with any like improvement. So we're incurring significant increase in compute without any benefits on the other end. But I think, yeah, any suggestions you might have, I might tag up with you after or over email to get some recommendations for things, because I'm definitely open for.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking the EOF approach, would that linearize? I mean, would that reduce?
Yeah, no, I mean, like, so in his approach, he is not considering, so he's just using the neural networks to get all the information.
But he's keeping the full non-linearity.
Yeah,
Right.
so that's what I'm saying. Like,
Yeah.
instead of that, if you
Do the
use some
slight
kind of,
approximation
yeah,
to-
yeah, so.
Sure. Okay. All right. Any other questions? Thanks. Oh, there's one up there. Castle.
Hi, that was a great talk, Nicholas. Thank you. My question is probably quite niche. With the energy-based models, have you looked at score matching for fitting those models?
I have not. No, I just so the training approaches and all that you know, come out of papers, and then they're implemented in this open source Learnergy library that's PyTorch backed. But the only changes to any of the training functions that I've used is kind of recent improvements to sampling that improve the capabilities of the Gibbs sampling, but never. I actually haven't heard of what was the approach that you mentioned.
It's called score matching. It was developed by someone called Hyvärinen for situations where that normalizing density is really intractable. So whenever you're sort of specifying a models like you do with where it's like an exponential and there's an energy term in the exponential, and that's what the main thing you care about, it can be quite good. But I'm still sort of learning the quirks of the method, and so yeah, I suspect there could be sort of what's called issues with the accuracy of the numerical differentiation. When it could be very slow to converge, but don't know yet. So I'll see what's in learn in that package you mentioned. So thank you.
Yeah. If anybody has any recommendations or any ideas for collaborations or for further improvements, yeah, please contact me. I'm more than happy to try these approaches out. Thank you both.
Well, any burning questions? How are we doing for time then?
We're doing great.
Okay.
Yeah, we've got 5 minutes left. They did a great job. It's on time.
Should we let them? There's no more questions? Okay. All right, we'll let you go, Nick. Thanks so much for your presentation today.
Thank you all for listening and taking the time. Appreciate it.